In the city of Moscow, if you stand with your back to the Kremlin, your back to Red Square, and walk directly away from it, you'll be walking along a street which in Soviet times was called Gorky Street. It's now gone back to its old name of Tverskaya. You walk up that street, you'll see many interesting buildings and monuments, but after you've walked for perhaps 25 or 30 minutes, on your left, you'll see a statue on a square that used to be called Triumphal Square, Triumphальная, but in Soviet times, particularly in the 1930s, was renamed Ploshchad Mayakovskого, that is Mayakovsky Square. If you look to your left on that square, what you'll see is quite a statue. You'll see a very, very large statue of a poet, standing with a great sneer on his face, obviously expressing a tremendous force and a tremendous looking down upon all the people around him, as if he had the right to sneer at the entire world. This, as you might imagine, is a statue of Mayakovsky, Vladimir Mayakovsky, the poet to whom the next two lectures will be devoted. It's rather ironic that this square became later on a gathering place of poets on the so-called Poetry Day, which occurred once a year in Soviet times, poets who would gather around the statue and would read poems to a certain extent even slightly critical of the regime and of the government under which they found themselves. It was not very easy to do this in Soviet times, and of course they didn't go very far with this, but nevertheless, to the extent that they could say something, they said it around that particular statue at that square at that time. It's somewhat ironic because, of course, Mayakovsky considered himself the tribune of the Soviet regime, the tribune of the revolution, the tribune of socialism in literature. And yet here, around this magnificent statue which so well captures the spirit of Mayakovsky, you found these young poets gathering. It's this statue, I think, which tells us a great deal about Mayakovsky, who was one of the most interesting Russian writers of the 20th century. He was a genuine master of all levels of the Russian language. He proudly called himself both a futurist and, as I said before, a tribune of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet regime. It was he who articulated the phrase about throwing Pushkin, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy overboard from the steamer of modernity. Everything that Mayakovsky said was on the side of those who were in favor of proletarian culture, of a very different culture, of throwing away the old, of making the new, of doing things that would shock people, that people might not quite understand, that would cause a huge rumpus in the world of culture of his day. Yet, at the same time, some of his best poetic lines made use of the Old Church Slavic language that we talked about at the very beginning of this course, and the religious imagery taken from ancient sources. Whenever Mayakovsky talked about love, there was something religious about it. There was something connected with the Holy Mother of God. There was something connected with the old tradition. Whenever he burnished his verse, and often it went in directions that nobody had ever thought of before, entirely new rhymes, entirely new rhythms, even new words made up, nevertheless, you could get the sense of the Church Slavic underneath it. Unlike many writers who spouted ideological phrases to cover up their lack of talent, Mayakovsky burned with a genuine fire of political passion, and his works aroused genuine passion, not stifled yawns, in his reader. He was totally unlike the very Soviet literature that he wanted to see established. He was totally unlike the very ideology that he tried to peddle off as his own. He started out in the first decade of the 20th century as a young man who came from the southern Caucasus Mountains to Moscow, where he joined the circles of bohemians and would-be revolutionaries. He loved to engage in extreme and outrageous behavior at public gatherings. He might bawl out his poetry or simply use profane and pornographic language intended to shock the bourgeoisie. As a matter of fact, one time he was asked to sign a visitor's book at a place that he visited as a poet. He put the book on the floor, he raised his leg, which had a very, very muddy boot, and stamped with this muddy boot upon the book. That, he said, was Mayakovsky's signature. It was this kind of gesture that made Mayakovsky very well known, and not always in a positive sense, among those who loved literature, because, of course, many people saw him simply as a brawling hooligan. But there was more to it than that. He was a real poet, a genuine possessor of the language, a genuine possessor of political passion, and a genuine possessor of poetic passion. He soon acquired a reputation for his poetry not only among the radicals of his day, but also among established poets and intellectuals. There was something marvelously unpredictable in his every move, and his powerful use of the language made a very strong impression. Pasternak, a very famous poet at that time, described him as sitting on a chair as if he were riding a motorcycle. Somehow he could make an unmoving chair seem as if it were speeding along a highway. Yeah, he might simply grab a Wiener Schnitzel in his mouth and swallow it all in one bite. He might just as easily grab food from a neighbor's plate at a banquet and then jump on the table to recite his verse. You could never quite tell what Mayakovsky was going to do, and of course he gloried in the fact that he shocked people, that the traditional people saw in him as somebody who was to be opposed, somebody who was dreadful, somebody who was going to do terrible things to Russian poetry. And of course he tried to gather around him a cadre of people, you might almost say shock troops of people, to attack poetry as if it were a fortress to be overcome. And in so doing, of course, change it in an entirely new direction. In October of 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution came along, Mayakovsky was more than ready to dedicate his talent in poetry to the revolution and the new state. In the early years of the Bolshevik regime, from 1918 to 22, which we've already described as war communism, there was an attempt to change the whole structure of the former Russian state and society, much in the spirit of that tabula rasa, remember the wax tablet that was to be wiped clean. Old economic organizations were crushed. Anyone who had experience in administering an estate or an enterprise was stripped of his or her position, not infrequently not only the position but of life itself. Topsy-turvy might well have been the slogan of the day. It was hardly surprising that such a policy led to a catastrophic decline of living standards, to mass undernourishment and even starvation, and to a huge increase in mortality during the cold Russian winter months, resulting from a terrible shortage of coal and heating fuel. It was in this context that Mayakovsky wrote his poem, Order Number 2, to the Army of the Arts. It's interesting that he calls the artists the Army of the Arts, as if somehow it would be possible to subject the very artists whom he wanted to do unexpected things the way he did to some kind of discipline. These people are presumably his fellow artists, tells us something about his notions about the organization of creative endeavor under the new regime. He evidently envisions a discipline group subject to orders and direction from a higher command, and yet how would Mayakovsky have been able to respond to higher commands? How would Mayakovsky, who always wanted to do something unexpected, who stomped with his boot upon the books, who did everything in ways that were to shock people around him, how would this same Mayakovsky submit himself to any kind of discipline? There's obviously a tremendous contradiction here, a contradiction in the personality of the man and in the art of the poet. And he refers to the various groups who've been striving to create different styles in poetry and literature. Futurists. Mayakovsky considered himself to be a futurist. The term was taken from the Italian futurists of the early part of the century. People who believed not in the present, but rather in the future. People who thought that new kinds of architecture, new kinds of art, all things that were not appropriate for the present, but rather would be appropriate for the future, would be the kind of art that would be the real art of a socialist regime, the real art of a new country which had been established in the 20th century. But of course there were not only futurists, there were the imagists, there were acmeists, all of them enmeshed in a spider web of rhymes. Mayakovsky seems to think they've achieved nothing of real worth. He turns to these groups and he says, you who call yourselves proletarians, you've taken on the title of proletarians in culture, and you've been satisfied, as he put it, to sew patches on an old-fashioned coat worn out by Pushkin. Now, of course, Mayakovsky obviously deeply admired the poetry of Pushkin, and yet he was tremendously contemptuous of those who constantly held up Pushkin as a standard for Soviet poetry. Pushkin, too, he wanted to throw over the side of the steamer of history, the steamer of modernity. All of these people, plus the careerists and the romantics, are warned, бросьте, забудьте, плюньте и на рифмы, и на арии, и на розовый куст. И на прочие мелехлюндии из арсеналов искусств. Throw it off, forget about it, spit on it, on the rhymes, on the arias, and on the rosebush, and all the other phony moaning from the storehouse of the arts. He says, and if you don't do what I say, they'll come at you with rifle butts. Mayakovsky doesn't mince words. He spares neither his rivals nor the description of painful punishment awaiting them if they refuse to follow orders. Now try to picture to yourself this chaotic organization of artists, each one of them with his own program, each one of them with his own language, some of them, as I said before, with language that went beyond sense to what they called trance-sense, that couldn't even be understood, some of them with a kind of music that you couldn't even see as music. Imagine them being submitted to the kind of discipline that Mayakovsky was talking about. Obviously, they weren't going to do it very easily. Obviously, this was going to involve him into all kinds of enormous power struggles and struggles in poetry, struggles in culture, struggle in everything of this country which was trying to establish himself. And of course, what is his program for the art necessary to the young regime? He gives a bleak picture of a country, as he puts it, where the locomotives groan for the lack of coal and oil, with the absence of technicians and mechanics. He demands an art that will выволочь республику из грязи, that will yank the republic out of the mud, as if the whole country has been bogged down like a ship, a river ship, which is stuck in the mud. And it's the poet's job to come to the ship and, as if they had ropes in their hands, pull it out of the mud. He couldn't deny that the nation was sunk in a terrible mess, and he cries out to the artist to help save it in discipline ranks very similar to the military. And this is expressed in an atmosphere completely dismissive of anything they've done before. You have to remember that at this time there was a tremendous creativity going on in Russia, and yet Mayakovsky is dismissing all of this in favor of some kind of disciplined art which will pull, as he puts it, pull the republic like a ship stuck in the mud. Now, the tone of this poem is quite different from a very famous one he had composed only a year earlier in 1920. It's called An Extraordinary Adventure, which happened to Vladimir Mayakovsky in a summer country house. Now, here is Mayakovsky, who calls himself the Tribune of the Revolution. He has submitted himself to being an artist for what was called Rosta. That is an organization which gave propaganda to people to how they should behave in a socialist regime. He's drawing pictures which shows them that they shouldn't spit on the street. They should rather spit in the spittoon. When they blow their nose, they shouldn't just do it out in the open, but rather they should use a handkerchief. All of these things which belong to a new sanitary culture of socialism. Furthermore, Mayakovsky himself was a man who was terribly, perhaps even neurotically, afraid of germs. Who, when he would go to a restaurant, would not use the silverware that was in the restaurant, but would bring his own silverware, wrapped in a handkerchief which he knew was sterile. Who would not even shake hands with somebody without a handkerchief in his hand because he was afraid of picking up germs. This poet, who had this entirely tidy sense of himself, was making propaganda to people who he said should make their lives, should make the society tidy and sterile the same way he has made his own life. The poem itself renders a scene in the middle of summer, with the sun, all scarlet, creating an almost unbearable heat. Now you have to understand that the Russians are not accustomed to very, very hot summers, particularly Russians in the central or northern part of the country, so that when the sun actually does come out in the summertime for a few weeks and shines down on them, it's very, very hard for them to take. And here he is sweating away, trying to make these propaganda posters, trying to make these propaganda slogans, and the sun up there is beating down on him. It's merciless, and he's enraged because here he is making propaganda posters for the new government, telling people how to behave in a proper socialist manner. And so he shouts to the center of the universe, "Hey there, Goldbrow!" He calls the sun Goldbrow. Now you have to understand that the new socialist government believed that it could control nature itself, that the job of the government was not to give in to nature, not to adapt itself to nature, but rather make nature adapt itself to the new regime. If they needed to unite seas that never were united before, they dug canals, about which we spoke in the lecture concerning Gorky. If they needed the fertilizer to make the ground more productive, they would find the fertilizer and chemicals which they would produce. If they needed things to stop disease, well, they would have medicine, they would have technology. The socialist government had tremendous faith in the ability of human beings actually to control nature, to bring nature to their own purposes. Of course, Russian literature many times had talked about what happened to people who tried to control nature. Those who think that they can control nature, that they are more powerful than nature is, are often destined to be overcome by nature. But here is Mayakovsky talking to the sun as if it were an equal, as if he had the same power of the sun.